everybody, I hope that you're all doing well. So today's video was inspired by a tweet that I saw, and it really does go to show how much not having my MacBook for a week really messed up my whole filming schedule and the videos that I had planned, because this tweet, it was meant to be a whole like, oh, I saw this tweet the other day. Actually, this tweet was from the 15th of August, so I'm more than a month late in making this video. However, it also goes to show how much this tweet has stuck in my head. The tweet came from my favourite public historian, Greg Jenner. For those of you who do not know, Greg Jenner is one of the historical consultants and writers on the TV show Horrible Histories. He also hosts a fantastic podcast called You're Dead to Me, which is a humorous historical podcast. And earlier in the year, he had a new book which was published, and his tweet reads, "I'm 93% over it, but sometimes I still feel so gutted my book came out in lockdown and I've not been able to witness a copy in an actual bookshop. It feels almost like it was never published, as if that's the proof my brain needs to say, I wrote a thing and it's real." And there were loads of responses to this tweet, like lots of people holding up Greg's book and saying, does this make it feel a little bit more real to see it with somebody else? And, you know, there were some lovely responses there, but, you know, the tweet did stick in my head because it is just a really sad situation. You know, I'm not a writer, published or otherwise, but I can imagine, I can empathise with how frustrating this whole situation must be. You've spent years of your life planning, researching, writing, editing a book. You finally got it to be published, and then a pandemic hits. Suddenly everybody is practically trapped in their houses for 5 or 6 months, and you're not able to celebrate it in the same way. You're not able to even do like the marketing and publicity plans that you had. And at the bare minimum, like such a delight for a writer is being able to go into, say, their local bookshop, see a copy of their book and have that swell of pride of, I did that. I wrote that, that's mine. Not only is that incredibly sad and frustrating, but also, like, if you've looked into any of the publishing news in the last couple of weeks, you'll have heard about the 3rd of September, which was like a big day for publishing. Like 600 titles were published. Once again, another massively frustrating thing, because having so many titles just piling into bookshops, you know, what are bookshops able to do with that? There was a lot of discussion about how unfair this is to debut authors and to smaller indie publishers, but you also have to think of how frustrating it must be to be one of those authors who was published during lockdown, who maybe thought, well, once lockdown is over, maybe we can get back to normal, but actually you've just been pushed out again. It's almost as if the world is saying to you, you had your chance and you blew it, when actually it was nothing to do with you. This situation was nothing to do with those authors who happened to be published around this time. So yeah, this tweet really stuck with me, and you know, it's sad. It's such a sad situation, and I was thinking, like, what can I do to spread just a little bit of positivity? And I thought that for a video idea, I would just go through the books that I have seen which were published between March, August time, and I just wanted to raise them up and have people talking about them again. And I would really encourage anybody who is watching this to please leave a comment with books that were published between March and August that you really enjoyed, because I am very aware that the books that I am going to be sharing are going to be maybe not mainstream books, but a lot of the time I pick things up based on recommendation and good word of mouth about a book. So I am very aware that a lot of my books, whilst maybe not like chart successes, maybe they aren't big mainstream books, I know that they are at least somewhat popular on BookTube and that a lot of people on BookTube might have heard of them. I know that my list of books that I have heard of is not necessarily going to be representative of debut authors. It may not necessarily be representative of small indie brands, and I would like to get as much discussion on as many books as possible. I also feel weirdly like in 2020 I have read more books that were published in this current year than I ever have before. Maybe it's because my book buying has been dominated more by online ordering and less from going into charity shops, where obviously there will be much more backlist stuff than there will be new releases. But no, I find it really interesting. Firstly, for books that were published either just before or during lockdown, I'm going to start with the book which inspired this video, which is Dead Famous, an unexpected history of celebrity from the Bronze Age to the Silver Screen by Greg Jenner. I read this back in April, May time, and I really enjoyed this. This is history non-fiction, and it talks about the development, the rise of celebrity practices, and also our attitudes to celebrity, because Greg Jenner argues within this book that our notions of celebrity are much older than we necessarily think. I think a lot of people think that celebrity is kind of a 20th century concept, but he actually charts it back to, I think, 1700. And that there are even also traces of what we would deem celebrity even earlier, but that really it was the 18th century that started to solidify the concept of the celebrity. It was the first time that like fan mail was a thing. It was also the first time that you would see celebrities interfering and playing a massive part in politics, and that really affecting public consciousness. We have typical famous historical figures like Lord Byron, Charles Dickens, David Garrick, Mary Robinson, Buffalo Bill, and then also other figures that you may not have heard of. And the main selling point I think for this is that it retains Greg Jenner's like signature hilarious witty writing style. If you have watched Horrible Histories or if you've listened to the podcast, you'll know that Greg is like a very funny writer. He really does believe in bringing humour into history to make it more engaging and accessible, and that is definitely well retained in here. I found myself laughing pretty much every other page, so highly recommend this. Next up is a book that needs no introduction, and I am maybe slightly cheating because this book came out, yes, in March, but definitely before lockdown talk started happening. This came out on the 5th of March, but it did come out around lockdown though, and this may be partially inspired by the fact that this book did not make it to the Booker shortlist, and I am still questioning this and ranting about it to anybody who would listen. How did this not make the Booker shortlist? How? So yes, I'm just going to touch on this briefly. This is The Mirror and the Light. This is the conclusion to the Thomas Cromwell trilogy by Hilary Mantel, and even though yes, this has gotten a lot of attention, I'm still going to include it in here as a lockdown book because it came out right at the beginning of March, so obviously there must have been like such a big campaign planned for this that never ended up happening. And yes, like I've mentioned, I am still very sad about the whole Booker situation. Don't even talk to me about it. A book that came out in lockdown but was not snubbed by literary prizes this year, however, is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This was published on the 31st of March. I will link below my review of Hamnet. This was a book that I initially did not really get on with very well, but then reread it and enjoyed it a lot more. I'm sure you've heard so much about this. It recently won the Women's Prize for Fiction and I think was well deserved. Brilliant book, you should definitely read it. Another book published on the 31st of March was My Doc Vanessa. This is a book that I think did get a level of like press and publicity campaign going on because I saw people talking about this from like a year before it came out. This was also on my favourite books of the year so far video, so safe to say I really enjoyed this. This tells the story of Vanessa Y, who as a teenager was groomed by her English teacher. It goes backwards and forwards through time with a dual timeline, one when she is 15-16 years old and another when she is in her 30s, and allegations against the teacher in question have recently come to the forefront. It is a book that is haunting and does deal with very dark topics, but one that I recommend that everybody reads. It is such crucial, essential reading. Next up, another lockdown book that came out is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. This came out on the 19th of May and is the prequel to the very popular Hunger Games series. As I did say at the beginning of the video, the list of books that came out during lockdown that I have picked up and read are not necessarily the most niche of topics. A lot of people have heard of this book. This tells the story of the 10th annual Hunger Games from the perspective of the original trilogy's villain, Coriolanus Snow. It is basically like a villain origin story. We get to see through this book the origins of the original Hunger Games and how they built up over time to be the spectacle that we know in the original series. And I know that this book had quite mixed reviews. There are a lot of people who didn't like this. I myself quite enjoyed it, but I think that's probably because I don't care quite so much about the games themselves. I am much more interested in this series for the discussion around dystopian societies and governmental control and how government wields power over its citizens, and that's much more what this book is about. There's much less focus on the action within the games, which I know is what a lot of people love about the Hunger Games, is the action, but you don't get so much of it in here because Coriolanus Snow is not a participant in the Hunger Games. This book is not perfect by any means. I wouldn't say that I liked it just as much as the original Hunger Games, but I do think it has some interesting insights into power, and I think it's a book that will launch a lot of interesting discussions, especially for its intended teenage audience. Another booktube darling is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. This was published on the 2nd of June this year. I have recently reviewed this in my reading wrap-up for September. I will leave that wrap-up with the review down below for you, but this was a really interesting, engaging book about racism and colorism, particularly between the 1950s, 1960s up until the 1980s, and also a book that has a lot to say about performance. And yeah, definitely recommend this one. Then lastly, of the books that I have actually read, we have Axioms End by Lindsay Ellis. This came out on the 21st of July and is a slightly different book to my usual fare. This is sci-fi set in 2007. We have basically got this kind of alternative history in which aliens have had a presence on Earth for a very long time, however they've been kept under wraps by the government. However, we meet our main character Cora Sabina at the beginning of the novel, where her father has been a whistleblower who has revealed the alien presence to the American people. While she is trying to keep her head down, she ends up having an encounter with one of these aliens who injects her with a substance which means that she is able to communicate and translate the alien language to humans, and therefore she becomes an intermediary. Like I say, this is not my typical read. I mainly picked this up because I really love Lindsay Ellis's content online, but I feel like this would actually be a very good book to bridge the gap if you are not typically a sci-fi reader. This is a book that has a lot to say about the medium of translation and what gets lost along the way. It has a lot to say about human nature and how we intermingle with other species, whether or not we would be able to cohabit with an alien species that are just as or more intelligent than us. Would we be able to make it work, or would there eventually be some sort of genocide on either side? So yes, this is my pile of books that came out during lockdown, which I have read. Now I also wanted to talk a little bit about books which were published during lockdown that I haven't read and that I'm quite interested in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of these books if you've read them. First up, we have Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevado. This came out on the 5th of May, and this tells the story of two half-sisters who do not know about each other. Their father has kept the existence of both of their families secret. However, when their father dies in a plane crash on the way to see one of the sisters, they end up discovering the other's existence. From what I understand, these two sisters start to learn more about each other, and it's really kind of like a character-focused story, focusing on how they are reconciling this lie that has been a massive part of their lives. In a very, very similar vein, there was Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones. This came out on the 19th of March and is a book that I'm actually currently reading, or listening, I should say. I'm currently listening to the audiobook, and it is very, very good. I'm currently waiting until the paperback comes out in October, but I'm very much enjoying what I'm listening to so far. This also tells a story of two half-sisters who have a shared father because their father is a bigamist. He has two families. From what I've listened to so far, this is different in that it's much more building up to this eventual reveal. At least I think that there's going to be a reveal. I kind of hope so. And we are slowly but surely unraveling the lives of these two sisters, because one of the sisters knows that she is a secret daughter and that there is another family, whereas one of them does not know. We start off the story learning about these things from the daughter who knows the secret, and how knowing that she was a secret taboo subject for her father, and knowing that her father goes off to one family and then will come for a night or two at her house, it really, really affected her, both personally in how she saw herself and also in her relationships with other people, especially men. So far from what I've listened to, we haven't yet gone on to the other family and to that other daughter, but I hear like you start off being very, very much on side with this first daughter, and then you start to see things from the other daughter's perspective, and you're just feeling sympathy for everyone involved. Next up, we have Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan. This is a book that was published on the 12th of April and is a book that has been very, very heavily compared to Sally Rooney, even though the plots seem slightly different to Conversations with Friends and Normal People. We do, however, have an Irish main character. Her name is Ava, and she goes to Hong Kong to teach English. I think a lot of the Sally Rooney comparisons mainly come from the fact that it is an Irish main character, an Irish writer. It's coming of age, there's a bit of romance and relationships drama. I'm not quite a Sally Rooney fangirl. I don't think that Normal People and Conversations with Friends are the best books in the world. However, they did kind of cement what my reading taste is, which is that I really like character-focused novels. So I'm always very appreciative of Sally Rooney for that. They've just never like quite hit the 5-star level for me. So I am very, very interested to see if Naoise Dolan does hit that 5-star. Next up, we have a slightly different book. We've got The Fall of the House of Byron, Scandal and Seduction in Georgian England by Emily Brand. This is non-fiction history. It came out on the 16th of April, and as the title suggests, it tells the story of the House of Byron, whose most notable famous figure is of course Lord Byron, but this tracks the 3 generations before and including him, and all of the different scandals that threatened to ruin the family's name. Next up is another history non-fiction, and not contentious at all. No. It is A History of the Bible, the book and its faiths by John Barton. I understand this is not going to be a book that appeals to everybody, but I'm quite interested in it. Full disclosure, I do come from a religious background. I was raised Catholic, but I'm much more interested in this from a historian point of view, because it is very much about the construction of the Bible, all of the different component parts that went into it over the very many years that these different parts of the Bible were written. It's a book about what we know about the Bible and also what we can never know about the Bible because it was written and all the different parts were written so very long ago. But it's also a book about the history of the Bible and how it has been interpreted and reinterpreted over time, especially when it comes to translation. And obviously, because I'm a big fan of Tudor history, I am very interested in reading the sections about the Reformation and the big debate over translating the Bible into vernacular languages rather than just keeping it in the Vulgate Latin. So yes, a book that is going to be contentious and is not for everybody, but I'm interested. And then the last two books are more on the like romantic comedy, chick lit kind of thing. We have Beat Read. This is by Emily Henry. It was published on the 20th of August this year. It's a book that I've seen actually quite a few people talking about on BookTube. It seems to be quite a favourite, and it basically tells the story of two writers who are in writer's block. I think one of them writes more like romantic comedy, chick lit, the other one writes more like psychological thriller, horror, and they don't really like each other, but like I say, both suffering from writer's block, and they decide that their way to try and cure this is that they are going to switch genres, and whichever of the two of them can get their book published first will win the bet. And from what I'm assuming, romance does start to blossom between the two of them, even though they initially cannot stand each other. I don't know, I just think that seems like a really cute premise for a book. And then lastly, on a similar kind of bend, we've got The Switch by Beth O'Leary. This came out on the 16th of April. This tells the story, I believe, of a granddaughter-grandmother pair, Lena and Eileen, who both decide that they are going to switch lives. So Lena is going to go up to Yorkshire, I believe, to her grandmother's home, and Eileen is going to go down to London where Lena is working, and they're basically going to switch lives for a couple of months because they're both feeling really stagnant and stuck and just not very happy with their lives. I read the flat share like this time last year and I quite enjoyed it, and I feel like this could be even better. I quite like this idea of this almost like Freaky Friday but not kind of situation. So yes, those are all of the books that I have to talk to you about today that came out in the last few months during lockdown. Like I say, please do let me know of any books that you have really enjoyed that came out between like roughly March and August time. I just really want to spread the word about as many books that came out during this period as possible, because I understand if you were a writer who was published during this time, it must be so disheartening to see the situation and how it is right now. Great use of words, Charlotte. I hope that you are all having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye!